Hey, what's up guys, welcome back to the channel where this week we'll be taking a look at Thermaltake's most premium liquid cooler, the Floe Riing RGB 360 TT Premium Edition. They really couldn't have made this any longer. I'll grab the coffee, this could take a while. So at surface level this seems to be really promising. It's a 360mm cooler with a metric crap ton of customization and pretty RGB illumination. It's extremely feature rich, but whether it actually adds any value is something we'll take a look at. It seems that with every passing year, manufacturers are trying to one-up their competition by adding features that ultimately don't mean a whole lot to consumers and are just marketing crap. I know you've got stuff to do, so I've put timecodes below if you feel the need to skip or refer back to them later. Lastly, I want to disclose that I was sent this cooler for review and I do get to keep it afterwards. I'm no salesman though, I wasn't influenced to say anything nice, nor would I ever work with a company that wouldn't allow me to freely express my own views. All of this is entirely my own opinion, it wouldn't be a review otherwise. And now, after that, let's get down to business. Opening the box, you're greeted with a great number of things. Firstly, there's a warranty information and installation instructions. They include stock fans, the Ring Plus 12, which we'll get onto later, the controller hub, a plethora of mounting hardware for AMD and Intel sockets, 2 cables, one to power the hub and the other to transfer data, and lastly you obviously get the cooler itself. Now we've got to quickly talk about the name of this product. It's difficult to transcribe how confusing the name must be for those who have only heard about it. Correct spelling for Floe and Ring seem to have been thrown out the window. That coupled with the long name, and maybe I'm just being pedantic, but if the product's good I don't think anyone will care. Before you buy any cooler, it's important to know whether you can even use it. This is mostly a compatibility thing. Will it fit in your case and does it support your motherboard socket? For Intel, the cooler supports LGA 2066, 2011 version 3, 2011, 1366, 1156, 1155, 1151, and 1150. So this is pretty much all Intel desktop sockets since 2008. As for AMD, it supports Threadripper 4, AM4, FM2, FM1, AM3, AM3+, AM2 and AM2+, all of which are AMD desktop sockets since 2007, minus the socket F, but let's be honest, you should probably look at upgrading your system first instead of your cooler if you're still using decade-old hardware. The pump itself spins at 3600 RPM at 12 volts, whereas the fans are 500 to 1400 RPM, plus minus 10%. In terms of clearance, you shouldn't have a problem with RAM, but the radiator is 393 by 120 by 27mm. I think this goes without saying, but a 360mm cooler will support 3 120mm fans. The tubes are made from a rubber that has been really nicely sleeved and is about 326mm long. This should only be a concern if you're mounting it to the front of the case, but it's still worth knowing. The controller is a small plastic box that powers the fans and enables other devices to interact with them either by changing the fan speed or the lighting. It also controls the pump lighting. The controller is a bit hit and miss though, not in terms of reliability or function, it's actually pretty good for that, but rather in its design. Firstly, it uses proprietary connections. I'm sure manufacturers have a reason for this other than being non-serviceable, but the fan and pump connectors are 5-pin and seem somewhat akin to internal USB 2.0 headers, but you can't use it there. Instead, the pump must be plugged into the first slot and the fans in subsequent slots for this to work. I'm not a fan of proprietary connectors, but making them look identical to internal USB headers is definitely going to confuse a lot of people. Next, the controller isn't mountable. There's no mounting holes to put in, say, a drive bay or SSD bay. You have to stuff it under the power supply shroud or tape it behind the motherboard tray. If you did still want to place it in a drive bay, you might come across some space problems since the cables don't just come out of the sides and the front, but also the back, so you have to twist them over. It's a pain to store, and it could have been made significantly easier with the addition of mounting holes. The controller does allow you to add up to an additional 15 controllers if you want to add more fans. This is achieved through the dip switches, where the combination sets the device ID. I'm not sure why anyone would need more than 2 controllers though, let alone 16. It still functions very well, as you'll see in a minute, but it's definitely worth mentioning. The benefit of using the controller in some twisted way is that it does visually reduce clutter when you're looking at the PC, since all of it will be hidden and none of the fan cables will be visible since they're not individually connected to the motherboard. It also directly controls the fan speeds, the fan light, and the pump light. The controller is powered and interfaces with the PC using the 2 included cables. The first cable is simply a power cable that... Wait a minute. Why is that a Molex connection? I'm not quite sure why manufacturers are still opting for Molex connectors over SATA power connectors. The problem isn't that Molex doesn't do the job, it does. rather that the end user experience when plugging it in is disappointing to say the least. They're difficult to connect, difficult to remove, and some of the pins easily come loose. The data cable connects via a USB 2.0 header on the motherboard and through micro USB to the controller. The cable splits into two, resulting in an additional micro USB end if you choose to add a second box. I think you can see where the problem lies. Firstly, the cables are incredibly long and somewhat thick due to their sleeving. Please don't clip that. This is both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, it allows you to easily reach the box if it's located far away from the Molex cable, but on the other hand, it still adds tremendously to the cable clutter. I'm personally using a full tower and I still think the cables are far longer than they should be. A simple solution would be to do what Noctua does, and that's to have a shorter cable and just provide an extension cable. The second problem is similar to the first in that we don't really get a choice on the cables. The data cable has two micro USB ends regardless of whether you actually need the second. The fans themselves are exceptionally good both in performance and aesthetics. In my testing, which we'll get onto later, they offer good airflow with low noise. The ends also contain rubber pads that reduce vibration, thereby reducing noise. Each ring has a fan that contains 12 lights and acts as a diffuser. The software allows you to form colours by varying the intensity of red, green and blue from 0 to 255. In short, you have a range of 16.8 million colours, but if we're being honest, you're not going to use all of that. You're going to use less than 10. It's still there though, but would make a difference if you're using one of the RGB modes because the hue will shift more seamlessly, so it's not a gimmick if you leave it on that. Anyway, the option's nice, and the first time I set up the cooler, my overall thought was, wow! Maybe it's because I've seen subpar implementations of RGB, but the camera really doesn't do the lights any justice. They are so much more vivid and stunning in person. The one dislike is that the cable length for each fan is about 90 centimeters. I can understand if these were to be plugged into the motherboard directly, but a meter long cable to reach the controller that is also equipped with really long cables makes little sense to me. I think long cables can be great, but for those who have the controller virtually next to the fans, they don't need 3 1 meter long cables. It just adds to the clutter. I'd love to see future iterations of say 40cm long cables with 50cm extensions. This would make a lot more sense. I normally wouldn't even think about bringing this up, but because each cable is sleeved, they're also significantly thicker than your average 3-pin cable too. One thing I really like is the pump design. It's stylish and clean, not tacky in any way. The black colour on the unit complements the white when it's turned off. Similarly, the Thermaltake branding is minimalistic, a simple ring with a TT logo in the centre that illuminates when the PC is powered on. Superb work from Thermaltake here, it really does look nice. The pump is your typical Acertech one. The heat is transferred through a copper base plate for maximum heat transfer. There's nothing new here. The tubes around the cables protrude from the bottom and can be rotated left or right. I'm going to skip over installation of the cooler since it's really straightforward and pretty much the same as any other liquid cooler. The instructions go over all of this in detail. The software is usable, but there's definitely room for improvement, at least in UI. It can be found on Thermaltake's website and downloaded directly from their servers. The download speed I was getting, I'm convinced my toast could be a better file server though. The software loads up with a warning message each time stating controller number 1. I assume this is to tell you that you're accessing the peripherals to link to the first controller, although the software doesn't look that professional compared to the likes of the NZXT cam and so on. It's pretty straightforward though for the most part. In the top right are profiles that save the lighting combinations and fan speed settings that you've made. To modify one, just alter it and click save. You can also do so much more though. For starters, you can dim the LEDs, change the profile from wave to static lights, to sound, thermal, cross, shooting star, black hole, aurora and flow. There's so much customization here, it's quite overwhelming. You can also change the colour of each of the different LEDs independently, how quickly each effect occurs and so on. In the most recent update, it seems they've even added more lighting effects, so really good stuff. The fan speed can also be controlled. The 3 buttons correlate to quick presets that you can choose. There's silent, which is a constant 50% speed or around 1160 RPM. Performance is max speed at around 1600 RPM. And lastly, you have PWM mode that allows the fans to speed up and slow down depending on the CPU temperature. The difference between PWM Silent and PWM Performance isn't very clear, but from what I've seen, PWM Silent will ramp up the fans up to a max of 50% duty cycle, whereas PWM Performance is up to 100% duty cycle. The 2 buttons on the left are quite redundant, but clicking PWM will allow you to alternate between a fixed speed and the PWM mode. You can also move the slider from one extreme to the other if you so desire. One quick note on a few things, the numbers in the top left indicate how many controllers you're using and which one you're currently modifying. You can rename the fans if you like. Lastly, when you first load the software, you may notice that the pump isn't automatically chosen, for lighting at least. I'm not sure why this is, but all you have to do is select the right cooler from the combo box, and it should recognise everything after that. The fans also report the RPM, which is neat, but I found the CPU temp meter to be inaccurate, and the refresh rate far too low to be usable. To summarise, the software isn't winning any awards for looks, but it's really easy to use. You can effortlessly change the lighting to exactly what you want, and that's damn great. One downside is that if you want to select a custom colour, you have to manually enter the number for red, green and blue. There's no slider, which would be a massive improvement and make it a lot more intuitive. It's my understanding that the mobile app doesn't work properly for many people, so I'm not sure whether they've just fixed the issue or I'm lucky, which in my case, time to play the lottery. I genuinely think it's the former though, since most of the poor reviews on Android are from previous versions of the software. Thermaltake have about 4 different but similarly named apps. The correct one is the TT RGB Plus, and it works. I simply load the app, and provided that I'm on the same network as the PC and I have Bluetooth enabled on my phone, I just select the device and from there I can start changing the lights. You can't change the pump light nor the fan speeds, but it just sticks when you exit the app. The testing methodology has been crafted to provide realistic results in daily tasks that stress the CPU. Most people purchasing the cooler will use the stock provided fans and also probably the pre-applied thermal paste. Whilst I will test the coolers using their provided fans, I will be using my own Arctic MX4 thermal paste to ensure consistency. Rather than only providing very specific but unrealistic results, the testing methodology and trials will be closer to what you can expect in daily tasks. The test bench can be seen on screen now, which includes the Fantix Enthoo Lux with my system fans running and the side panel closed. You can see the arrangement of the fans in the description below. The overclocked 5820K I'm using is excellent, as Haswell E's CPUs can get extremely hot, and rather than using Intel's toothpaste TIM, the heat spreader is soldered to the chip. All 6 CPU cores are totaled and then averaged over a span of the final 5 minutes with intervals of 5 seconds. Real temp is used to log the core temperature, CPU frequency and CPU utilization. To control for the varying ambient temperature that reduces thermal headroom, the results will be based on the temperature of the CPU minus the ambient temperature of that room. Monitoring the frequency and utilization will allow me to check whether the CPU is performing the way it should. The CPU is locked at an overclock of 4.4 GHz on all cores, so a ×44 multiplier. V cores are locked on 1.195 volts, and both Intel SpeedStep and Turbo Boost are disabled. Whilst a normal system would not disable SpeedStep nor Turbo Boost, I want the CPU to always be at 4.4 GHz so that there are no discrepancies whilst testing. Otherwise the CPU may report low temperatures because it has downclocked itself to save power. The system fan speeds are manually controlled and pumps are always set to 100%, whereas the GPU fan speeds are set to 40% to maintain consistency. Lastly, the default fans provided with the cooler will be used unless stated otherwise. The tests themselves are quite simple. There are 4 different tests that only change the speed of the fans. The first has the fans set to 100% duty cycle, the second is a 50% duty cycle, the third is PWM on the performance preset, and the final is PWM on the silent preset. The fan RPMs on both the PWM modes will vary uncontrollably, but most closely simulate what a typical user would use. At each stage I'll be measuring the ambient temperature and the core temp averaged across 5 minutes, one set of results when the system is idle, and another under full load. For stress testing software we're using Asus RealBench for a duration of 1 hour. Due to the specific heat capacity of the liquid inside the liquid coolers, it takes time before the system actually reaches peak temps. Science Studio has an excellent explanation video on that. As for RealBench, it stresses the CPU by carrying out real-world tasks like video encoding and file compression. Maxed temps are less extreme but more realistic than what you'd find with Prime 95. Finally, I'll also be measuring the acoustic performance of the cooler using SPLN-FFT, which is an iOS app. According to Weber, and I quote, "During the 4 tests we conducted, this was the only app to absolutely nail the results each and every time. In fact, the app's results were so close to the results obtained using the $2,000 noise meter that the tiny differences between the two are probably due to a sampling error. The sound meter is placed 50 centimeters away, pointing at the cooler and the fans. The side panel will be removed, but would typically reduce audio levels. Now that we're done with testing, let's get onto the results. When testing at 100% fan speed, the software reported an RPM of 1580, which is higher than the rated 1400 RPM max for the fans. So with the fans at 100% duty cycle, we saw the cooler maintain a steady temperature of 30.8 degrees Celsius over ambient at full load, and 8.5 degrees Celsius over ambient when idle. Simply put, this is excellent. If we take a look at temperature over time, we see fluctuations of about 5 degrees at load, and this is likely due to the average of all cores, where the single core could report temps that are 10 degrees higher than the other ones. At idle, we see a drop in temps between 1080 and 1320 seconds. I checked the frequency and utilization, and there wasn't any change in either, they were both at max. But it is only 3 degrees, so nothing significant. At 1580 RPM, we do see noise levels of 44.1 dBA. At 50% duty cycle, the fans reported an average of 1160 RPM, and as expected, the temperature increased for both idle and load compared to the previous test. We saw a temperature of about 34.8 degrees Celsius over ambient at load, and 9.7 degrees Celsius over ambient at idle. Again, this is great performance, but sacrifices a little thermal headroom for the benefit of sound, as we'll see in a minute. One thing to note was that the temperatures fluctuated more at this speed. At idle, the temps were a little more interesting though. We saw a spike around 420 seconds by about 6 degrees, and a dip at 1410 seconds by about 2 degrees. My thoughts are that this is just due to the hottest core increasing in temperature, which would cause the average to increase as well. At a constant speed of 1160 RPM, we do see noise levels about 39.5 dBA, so noticeably quieter than the previous test. In comes PWM set to the performance profile inside the Thermaltake software. There isn't a constant RPM to the fan, as the temperature changes, so does the duty cycle. Essentially, the hotter the CPU gets, the faster the fans will spin in order to better transfer the heat and lower the CPU temperature. With that said, we saw similar performance to the first test. At load, the CPU ran at an average of 31.4 degrees Celsius over ambient, with idle temperatures of 8.7 degrees Celsius over ambient. The temperature over time graph shows that at load it followed a pattern. It increased by a few degrees, then dropped, then increased again, and so on. This is likely due to the fans ramping up and down due to the temperature of the CPU. Idle temperatures were extremely consistent though. Okay, so measuring the noise levels is a bit more difficult when they're constantly changing dependent on the CPU temperature, but I found that in the PWM performance mode, I was getting 38.9 dBA at idle and 44.7 dBA at load. Lastly, before we get onto acoustics, we have PWM on the silent profile, and I believe that in this mode, the fans will ramp up to 50% duty cycle, which is why we see the numbers we'll see in a minute. At load, we saw an average temperature of 39 degrees Celsius over ambient, with idle temps of 9.8 degrees Celsius over ambient. Between all of the different temps, this was the worst one and shows results akin to what we'd expect on a 240mm cooler, albeit with quite a noise output. Temperatures over time reported reasonably large fluctuations, especially at idle, most likely due to the cooler prioritizing quieter sound levels over thermals. In the PWM silent profile, we do see noise levels of 39.4 dBA at idle and 39.8 dBA at load. Many of the results are similar though, so it's likely within margin of error. So for this, I'm going to be placing recordings of the sounds next to each other, just so that you get an idea of the relative difference between them. They were all recorded at the same level and will all receive the same boost, so this is more about the difference and loudness between them. This is with the mic 50 centimeters away from the cooler and with the GPU fans and system fans disabled. Based on these figures, I think it's clear which mode you should choose for this cooler. The PWM Performance mode offers the best balance of cooling to sound levels. The cooler will be either extremely quiet at idle and ramp up when it's needed. At that point, the cooler will still be reasonably quiet at load. It's noticeable, yes, but when you've got a headset on, you're not really going to notice it. Okay, so in summary, the cooler offers excellent performance. This is what you'd expect from a well-designed 360mm cooler. It also offers relatively low noise output. The pump makes the normal water flowing noise at startup, but after the first 10 seconds I really couldn't hear it, and that's at max RPM. Compatibility is a big plus, provided your case supports a 360mm radiator, and this is due to the rad being thin, and the extensive socket support that you get. It goes without saying, but the lighting is highly customizable. You can choose one of the many presets and can change each LED individually if you so desire. Sometimes you get a product that does RGB, but it's more for the sake of having it for mass appeal. This is not one of those times. The lights are vivid and look fantastic. This is done really well. Next, the whole system is scalable. If you want to add more of the same fans, you can hook up multiple controllers. It seems that most AIO liquid coolers use the same mounting installation. Needless to say, it's easy. For the money, you wouldn't expect anything less, but the fans of this unit are nothing short of amazing. The desktop software is easy to use and works well. It might not be the most visually appealing, but you'll only use it to change the lights and the fan speeds anyway. The mobile app seems a bit gimmicky, as I can't think of a reason why you'd need to change the lights using your phone when your PC is literally within arm's distance, but you know, it works. Some people might find a use for it, I couldn't. Lastly, the branding isn't horrid, it's clean and stylish. As for drawbacks, one drawback is the fans use proprietary connectors. Maybe this is done to ensure that the lighting works properly, but I don't see why it couldn't have been able to work with a 3-pin connector. If it was done like that, maybe the only thing you would lose out on is lighting, but it would be a lot more serviceable. Another one is that the cables are long and thick due to their sleeving. Considering the cables are going to be hidden anyways, why would they be designed this way? A 90cm long cable only adds to the clutter, and when you're using multiple fans, this can get annoying quickly. Thermaltake, if you're watching this, consider reducing the length to half of that and providing extensions for those who need it. So this is probably my biggest concern other than cost, but the fan controller just isn't well designed. You can't mount it properly because there are no mounting holes, it's pretty thick, so whether you can fit it behind the back panel is anyone's guess. And last but not least, it has cables coming from all sides, making it difficult to mount in a drive slot. The controller also uses Molex to 5-pin for power. Not a deal breaker, but if none of your other peripherals use Molex, it's another cable that you have to add. And lastly, we have cost. Cost is the biggest downside by far. You're getting a lot for your money, well, as much as you can get for an AIO CPU cooler, but it's still a hefty price. Whether the added value of RGB lights makes it the premium in price is your decision. So conclusion time, I think this is one of those examples of a CPU cooler that excels in many categories, but is let down by the price. The cooler seems to be all over the place in terms of pricing, but more or less around £185 or $175 at the time of the recording. It's priced about the same as the Kraken X72, and it seems you're going to be paying a pretty premium for that RGB tax. It's not a bad product, in fact it's quite the opposite. It's just so costly that you'll see many people going for a 240 or 280mm AIO, even if they don't offer as good cooling performance. If the price is lower to say £140 or $150, it will be significantly more price competitive. Personally, it's hard for me to justify spending this much over an EVGA CLC 280 just for pretty lights. After all, that is where a lot of the money's going. Anyway, I hope this helped. If you liked the video, then give it a thumbs up, and if you have any questions, leave them down in the comments below or tweet at me. This has been Proto, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in my next video.
Back from the dead.